Hello and welcome to week 11. So this week we're talking about totalitarianism. And this is part of where I think everybody gets confused when we talk about these concepts of communism and fascism and why even today communism has this um, ring or this connotation to it that it is very, very bad. Well, that's because the practice of it has been very, very bad. And as I've tried to make clear before, and I'll come back to it again at the end of this, the ideal of communism and the reality of it are two very different things. And the ideal is this idea that, well, everybody's going to work hard because everybody understands that whatever they're doing is making life better for everybody. And in response, everybody gets everything equally. So nobody's poor, nobody's starving, nobody's suffering. Um, in an ideal communist state, if you wanted to be an artist, you could be an artist as long as you're producing and doing something that's constructively good for the society as a whole in your free time. You could then do whatever else you wanted to do, but for the most part, the idea is that you work. Everybody works optimally. Everybody shares optimally. The more everybody works, the higher the standard of living. The more everybody shares, etc. Again, ideal. The practical reality, though, and this is what happens after Lenin dies in 1924 and Joseph Stalin becomes the uh, leader of the Communist Party and of the Soviet government in the new Soviet Union, is this thing called totalitarianism. And the reason we talk about it now is because it emerges as a byproduct of World War I, as a byproduct of the technological developments that have happened literally since 1890, and as a byproduct of the militarism and the massive production of military weapons that occurred before World War I, but certainly continues on afterwards. So what is totalitarianism? It's entirely a 20th century construction. Is the idea of a government that literally attempts to control, and I'm going to use the word attempt because to date, uh, this hasn't been achieved in its entirety, even though with AI and a lot of the new technologies, that's something that many people worry about in the future. The idea that government controls every aspect of a person's life, even down to how they think. Now, again, is that how they think that it becomes the bugaboo, as it were, for the 1930s and periods after that. But again, as things go on in the future, technology, how do we know? All right, so the Britannica definition that I have here for you is a form of government that theoretically permits no individual freedom and that seeks to subordinate all aspects of individual life to the authority of the state. By the beginning of World War II, totalitarian had become synonymous with absolute and oppressive single-party government. Modern examples of a totalitarian state, Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, and I would point out to you, you don't notice that it says that after Stalin, because after Stalin, even his immediate successor, Khrushchev, acknowledged that Stalin's reign of terror and the massive numbers of people he had killed were horrific, and that was not what the Soviet Union wanted to do. But even around that, Adolf Hitler in Germany, Mao Zedong's Republic of China, and then North Korea under the Kim dynasty, which still exists today. There are other examples, Pol Pot in Cambodia, certain attempts at totalitarian government in the Middle East. Some would argue that ISIS is an attempt at totalitarian government. Certainly the use of many of the qualities that we're going to talk about in defining totalitarianism, you can contribute to ISIS. So totalitarianism still exists today. There's not really much question about that. It's just a matter of how well it's implemented. And again, is that attempt to control every aspect of a person's life in a totalitarian regime. All right, so going on next, here we go. Characteristics of totalitarian regimes. The single party dictatorship. And what this means is that, as we see in Stalin's Russia, there's only one party. It's the Communist Party. If you want to be elected, and they do hold elections, but to be elected, you have to be a member of that party. No other party is allowed. The same thing holds true in China today. It holds true in Nazi Germany, where the first thing they did was get rid of every other party. Same thing occurred in Mussolini's Italy. So yeah, it's the idea that there's one party, that you have to meet certain very high qualifications in order to join that party, the biggest one of which is you have to have a very strong sense of party loyalty or loyalty to the leader. And again, that leader is usually a very charismatic dictator. State control of the economy. And this is where fascism and communism are going to differ. I've got the last slide. I'm going to talk about that. But it is definitely state control of the economy, the idea that the government is controlling who can sell what, how much they can sell, at what price they can sell it, etc. The third one is police spies and state terrorism. Now, we're going to talk about terrorism a lot from this point out. State-sponsored terrorism is where we are with this. It's the idea that your actual government itself uses terror, fear, violence, even murder in order to intimidate the people to do what the government wants them to do. Number four, very strict censorship and government control of the media, because this way you control what people hear. There is only one thing people hear, and what they hear is what the government wants them to hear. And this becomes problematic because if the only message you're getting over and over and over and over all day long is the same thing, eventually your brain doesn't have a choice but to absorb it and consider it to be fact, as it were. So that state censorship, the inability for anybody to say anything other than what the party line or the government line is a big part of how the government retains control over everybody. The use of schools and media to indoctrinate and to mobilize citizens, usually against a scapegoat. The best example of the scapegoating, of course, is Nazi Germany, where the Jewish people were considered to be the root of all problems in German society. But in Stalin's Russia, he basically structured the educational system so that children were literally taught that it was in their family's best interests for them to rat them out. If they ever heard their parents saying anything that was even lightly critical of government policy, children were taught, applied pressure to, rewarded if they turned their parents in, or any other member of their family. And I mean, think about this. It's pretty horrific because in reality, of course, the government wasn't going to recondition or help educate their parents or their family members. They're going to lock them up in prisons and either kill them or send them to concentration camps. Um, but this whole idea that teaching children, basically alienating them from their family source, is a big part of the construct of totalitarian regimes. We see it with Hitler Youth in Germany, definitely with the way Stalin orchestrated things in the Soviet Union. And then, of course, the last one, unquestioning obedience to a single ruler. And by this, we mean literally unquestioning obedience, not even asking a question to get further clarification of an order. It is to specifically do what you are told with no discussion whatsoever. So complete and total unquestioning loyalty to that leader. All right, and again, totalitarian regimes, when you look at the big header of totalitarian regimes, you're going to see under it both Nazism, Mussolini's fascism, and then, of course, communism as it existed under first Stalin and then later under Mao Zedong as well. All right, so this is a start. What I've basically done with this chart, it's over the next three things, is a comparison of Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini, and the big things that we think of when we think of totalitarianism, and the rise of these men to it. So the first one is, of course, how they rose to power. In all three cases, they basically rose through what should have been a democratic system. Yes, even the communists, even the Bolsheviks, under Lenin, had this idea that there was a party. That party should vote on who was supposed to lead. Lenin himself had anticipated that at his death, his right-hand man Trotsky was going to become the leader. But Stalin managed to well, he was the right man in the right place, the right time, literally. At the point in time where Lenin died in 1924, or 28, sorry, it could be 28, Trotsky was out with the army, out in the field. The Civil War was still ongoing. Trotsky was the commander-in-chief of the Red Army, the reinvented Russian army, now the Soviet army. He was trying to put down the last of the Civil War. When Lenin died, Stalin was the one in Moscow, and he basically went through a series of contortions, created a couple of triumvirates in a similar way to the way Julius Caesar had done in the Roman Empire, basically bringing the power to himself. And he emerged literally as the new leader of the party before Trotsky could even get back to Moscow. And almost immediately afterwards, Stalin turns towards these series of purges, claiming that there were enemies within the Bolshevik party itself that they had to be gotten rid of. He staged a number of very public show trials, accusing old members of the party of being disloyal to him and to the new party ideology, etc., and basically purged the party and then later everywhere in government of anyone who wasn't completely loyal to him. Hitler and Mussolini, and again, to make this clear, I mentioned it last week, I'll do it again this week. Mussolini creates fascism in the 1920s, Hitler models after him, but Hitler kind of comes up with fascism 2.0. In both instances, both Mussolini and Hitler rise to power through a democratic process, even though they do use their personal armies, Mussolini's black shirts, Hitler's brown shirts. These were men who originally started out as veterans of World War I, but over the course of the years that both Mussolini and Hitler were gaining in popularity, they brought in all kinds of unemployed younger men who had never been in the army, but who adopted a lot of the militarized ways of the older vets. So the brown shirts and the black shirts both went about, particularly during the periods ramping up to an election, intimidating people. And on election days, they would be outside polling areas, effectively making sure that anybody who didn't vote for Mussolini or Hitler or their respective candidates for certain positions either was beaten up and intimidated so that they would either vote for the Nazi or fascist politician or would not vote at all. So in both of their cases, once they attained power, Hitler and Mussolini both created states of emergency. Hitler did it by claiming that the Reichstag fire was set by communists who were upset that they lost the election. Most historians actually believe that the Nazis themselves set fire to the Reichstag building so they could blame it on the Communist Party. Whatever the case, that fire and the destruction to the building, it wasn't totally destroyed, but it was damaged enough that Hitler used it as a justification for declaring a state of emergency and suspending the Constitution, which would be something he would keep in place literally until 1945. Mussolini does a similar thing. I would point out that almost all democratic governments, the United States included, have clauses in their constitution that will allow for the suspension of the Constitution during crises or declared states of emergency. In the U.S., this has only been enacted once so far, and that was during the Civil War, and that was Lincoln, who in attempts to get control of recaptured southern territories, instigated martial law, suspending the Constitution in those new areas so that he could get control. So, all right. The other quality in all three is this idea that there is an enemy. There is someone who is out to bring down the new state. And with this in mind, sorry about that, in Stalin's case, it was anyone who challenged him, particularly capitalists. One of the very first mass killings perpetuated under his control, some argue it's a genocide, was the killings of the people who were called the kulaks, the upper middle class farmers who owned equipment or who had equipment who were not all that happy about the collectivization of all their land, the fact that they were losing control of their land. Basically, Stalin had his army go in and kill them all so that it wouldn't be an obstruction to the collectivization process. Hitler, of course, the best example of the enemy, the internal enemy, of course, for him was the Jewish people or anyone who challenged his power. And to that end, he made the Jews definitely a scapegoat for everything that was wrong in Germany, blaming them for literally the passage of the Treaty of Versailles, the punitive clauses in it, and everything that the German people were upset about. Mussolini also, capitalist, anyone who challenged his power, particularly those who had deprived Italy of land and wealth after World War I, basically looking at the League of Nations and external people. Now I'm going to point out here that I use the word capitalists in both of these cases. Stalin, of course, the communist society doesn't acknowledge the idea of personal ownership of property. Therefore, capitalism is very bad. In Mussolini's case, though, and as we'll talk about at the end, one of the big differences between fascism and communism is that fascism is actually kind of like capitalism on steroids. So when Mussolini's complaining about capitalists, what he's complaining about are people who want to keep all of their proceeds and profits for themselves, not channel some of those profits back into the nation. So very, very specific definition of capitalist that Mussolini's using. All right. Other things, state-sponsored terrorism. Now, again, this is one of the first areas of terrorism that we're talking about, and I would warn you, terrorism itself is defined as the use of terror to achieve a political end. And that with that terror usually has violence accompanying it. If not violence, then actually the definite threat of violence. And that's part of where state-sponsored terrorism comes into play. It's the use traditionally, and certainly in the 1930s, of organizations created by the state whose job were effectively to spy on the citizens themselves. In the new Soviet Union, Stalin had the Cheka, which would later become the GRU. Their worst prison would be Lubyanka, which still existed all the way up to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Many argue that Putin has reinstated Lubyanka. It was a prison located in the basement of the Kremlin where those people who were accused of being traitors or spies were taken and literally tortured, often tortured to death. Hitler, of course, had the Gestapo. You cannot have watched anything about Nazism without seeing the Gestapo, the guys in the black coats who everybody, even people in the military, are scared to death of because their job literally was to ferret out spies. To that end, they had both concentration camps and death camps. And these are two different things. Believe me, concentration camps were places where people were put primarily for labor. Concentration camps are often called labor camps. Death camps, however, were those camps specifically designed with the gas chambers, with the experimental methods for the fastest possible way of killing the largest number of people at one time and the disposing of their bodies. So yeah, the death camps are particularly horrific. And the Gestapo runs all of those in Hitler's Germany and in the territories Germany controls. Because the death camps themselves, none of them were actually located in Germany proper. They were located in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, in areas around Germany. There's an argument to be made that the German people who often say they didn't know about the Holocaust, or if they suspected it, they didn't want to know about it. There's an argument that one of the reasons why so many can claim that is because Hitler was uncertain as to how his own people would respond to that, so he didn't put the death camps literally in Germany where his people would have to see them. Mussolini had the OVA, and the interesting thing with the OVA, again, Mussolini kind of the lightweight in this scheme. The OVA was definitely a state-sponsored terroristic organization. It also had its torture facilities and its ways of running with people. But Mussolini didn't create a massive, large enemy quite the same way that Hitler and Stalin did. And therefore, the OVA was much more focused on literally spying on their own people. Genocide. Now, your question for this week has to do with the relationship between genocide and totalitarianism. And there's a big debate. Is genocide a function of totalitarianism? Or can you have genocide without totalitarianism? Or can you have totalitarianism without genocide? It's kind of an iffy thing. One could argue that you can have totalitarianism without it. Mussolini didn't appear to have too many genocides. Hitler, of course, did. Not only did he target the Jewish people, of which over 6 million were killed by the end of World War II. He also had the Romani, the gypsy people who he targeted for annihilation, anybody who was determined to be mentally or physically handicapped, gay people, male, female, transgender, all of those, and Slavs. And to make sure that we're all clear on this, that he had a much longer list of people who did not come into play yet because he hadn't managed to get control of all of Europe. Had he won the war, there would have been many, many more genocides. Stalin, over here, starting with the killing of the kulaks, as I mentioned, approximately 30,000 of those during collectivization. The Holodomor, the one we can technically put our hand on and say, yes, this was genocide, when he literally starved the Ukrainian people themselves almost to annihilation from 1932 to 1933. And then throughout the course of his dictatorship, which goes all the way up to the 1950s, he would just randomly get up every morning and decide that this was his hit list of people who had to go that day. Sometimes it was just political people he didn't like politically, but at least once, twice, three, four times a month, he would target an entire range of people that he just decided they weren't loyal. He didn't like them. Their ethnicity prevented them from integrating completely into the new Soviet Union. Their religion prevented them from adopting the true Soviet ideal. Any number of reasons, any variety of a number of reasons, he would just randomly set up tens of thousands, 20 of thousands of people to die that day or that week. So yeah, pretty horrific guy. The estimate with him, and it is an estimate, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 million people died during his control of the Soviet Union. 80 million. So, all right, mind control. And this is a big function of totalitarianism. It goes back again directly to that point I was trying to make about trying to control your thoughts. In all cases, state-run media, which was already on that list of ways that you tell a totalitarian society. Only one opinion comes out. It's the opinion of the state about everything. Only one interpretation of situations comes out, and it is the state interpretation. There is no freedom of thought, freedom of conversation, freedom of the press, freedom to congregate. All of that is out there. There are no individual liberties, and therefore there is nothing in there that people can think about themselves. In all cases, the use of show trials to intimidate people, usually show trials targeting upper levels of the government. And quite often in Hitler and Stalin's, these were guys who were quite surprised to discover they woke up one morning and were being arrested and being put on trial. In all cases, also the control of education, making sure that children were responsible for turning in their parents or family members, again, for the betterment of the state. Gender politics, in all cases, a staunch return to patriarchy. Interestingly, under communism, everybody's supposed to be equal, regardless of gender. But in practical reality, Stalin's Soviet Union still reinforced the idea that women were responsible for children and raising the family. So even though a woman could work 10 to 12 hours a day and were, like men, required to, often they still had to go home and take care of the house at the end of the day. Definitely with Hitler and Mussolini, there were laws passed that encouraged women to not work, not to take jobs from men, but also to stay home, have more and more babies in both Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. Women who were producing um, children for the nation, good Aryan children in the case of the Nazis, were rewarded economically for doing so. Rations went up for the family. There was an actual birth allowance if you gave birth to a living child that was considered to be in the Aryan race or a true German or a true Italian. You actually got like a $700-800, not US dollars, but Reichstag dollars, liras, as a reward for that. So definitely a repression of women as well. All right. The other big thing in totalitarianism, particularly in the 1930s, was the idea that everything the state was doing was being driven by the impending war. War was inevitable. Now, this makes sense definitely with Mussolini and Hitler, both of whom were doing massive government spending. So they had to keep their economies operating by justifying spending all this money on their militaries and on these new military weapons. So definitely this idea of fear of being attacked, but also particularly in Hitler and Mussolini's case, this need to expand, to return their nations to the great glory of empire. And to do that, they had to conquer things. Hitler called it Lebensraum, that the German people needed living room. He and Mussolini both argued that their initial forays into war, or certainly into assault, were designed to give their people back what they had lost from World War I. And for a long time, this is going to work as part of that, as we talked about last week, policy of appeasement, because with the Great Depression in place and the rest of Europe and the United States struggling just to feed people, nobody wanted a war. So they were willing to say, okay, as long as you're lying to us and it's a good lie and you're just trying to put your people back together, then fine, whatever. So, but again, this idea, war was inevitable. They were going to be attacked, so often they had to attack preemptively. This is a big part of the mechanisms of both Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, and to a certain extent for Stalin, definitely. His big rush, of course, was to get everything tied up and put together before he was attacked from the West. And to be fair again to Stalin, it's not like the West hadn't already, at the end of World War I, put troops on the ground in Russia to aid the White Army. So his fears, in some respects, were very legitimate. Britain, France, the United States had already made an attempt to intervene in Russian, then Soviet politics by ending the Civil War, by fighting on the side of the White Army. So yeah, Stalin probably more so than either Hitler or Mussolini had reason to be concerned about the possibility of imminent attack. All right. So again, totalitarianism, total control. I would point out the big point in this one is technology, that this is a big part of the 20th century, because at this point you've got loudspeakers, so that the governments could put loudspeakers anywhere that was public, so people were constantly being bombarded with messages from the government. Variety shows were playing martial music, had comedians making jokes about the enemy, about these other people that we had to watch out for. Television shows reinforced ideas of a woman's place being in the home, the idea of the patriarchy, all of the things that the governments were trying to implement. Media did that, and it didn't do it just by constantly, having speeches played over and over and over again, which it did. I mean, there was a lot of that too. Um, but also just through everything, all entertainment was geared toward validating the state control and making sure people knew who the enemy was and to make sure they themselves weren't the enemy. All the things you're not supposed to do. All right. And again, the difference between fascism and communism literally comes down to the economy. They are both totalitarian states, definitely in the 1930s. And again, with communism, even into, in some respects, the present with China. Even though they've relaxed some of their totalitarian strictures, they're still very much trying to control people. The Kim dynasty in North Korea, etc. The difference here, though, is in the economy. In communism, everybody gets everything equally. In the practical reality, while Stalin still touted this idea that we're all equal, everybody gets the same things. Of course, those people who are in party leadership are getting more. They're the ones who have the villas out on the ocean to be able to go visit during their summer vacations, and they get vacations unlike everybody else. They get the better quality foods, more of the better quality foods, the better apartments to live in, the better cars. All those things become part of being part of the party hierarchy. So even though everyone is supposedly equal, the party leaders were, and this was the Russian saying at the time, more equal than anyone else. Fascism, however, operates on the principle of capitalism on steroids. And by that, what we mean, and Mussolini starts this with his corporatization of Italy. What we mean by that is not corporations like we think of them, but it means classes, effectively, of workers. And what Mussolini did was he froze work positions where they were. Whatever job you had when he came into power was a job you were going to continue to have. There were going to be no raises, but there were also going to be no cuts in wages, and you couldn't get fired. I mean, you had to do something tremendously egregious to get fired. Instead, you were going to get enough to live on. The government was going to make sure that you had food, that you had a minimum standard of living. But it wasn't going to be like poverty. It was going to be just good enough that most people couldn't really complain, didn't really complain, because they couldn't. You didn't have the option to strike. You didn't have the option to walk out on the job. You didn't have the option to demand anything. And part of the way Mussolini and then later Hitler kept this going was by saying we're in a state of emergency. You're being unpatriotic if you put your needs above that of the nation as a whole. And right now we have this whole potential war, etc. So they kept wages static, which meant that business owners could make a tremendous amount of money. If you don't know anything about business, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, expenditure in any business is paying wages to the employees. So freezing them, making it so that no matter what they were doing, they were going to get paid the same thing. And it didn't matter what factory they were working at, there was no competition that way. By keeping those wages static, it maximized the amount of profit that the guys who owned the businesses were going to make. But in return for that, and the fact that they were actually making more money and being able to live as good a life as they wanted, the government, the dictator, Hitler, Mussolini, demanded that they contribute more to the nation because it was the nation that was providing them with this. And a big reason for that, of course, was because it was the nation that was mainly buying their products. It was the government itself. So these guys had an obligation to contribute to the national economy, both through taxation at very high rates, but also through volunteerism. Show your devotion to the country by volunteering some percentage of your profits to the government itself so the government can keep buying from you. Now, again, the interesting thing with fascism was had it not been for that declared state of emergency, these guys would never have made enough money to keep their governments going. All right, so with all of those things in mind, and again, this idea that fascism and communism, as we understand it, are both functions of a totalitarian state or ways that totalitarian states operated, let's look at the question for this week. What's the relationship between totalitarianism in the 20th century and genocide? And again, I just gave you kind of part of that answer, but of course I want you to flesh that into more detail. In an age when tolerance for diversity has been growing, which it had been up to that point, why does genocide still occur? And it does. We read with some regularity about potential genocides. Why does this still happen? What can we learn, if anything, from the genocides of the first half of the 20th century? Is there a relationship between technology, power, and genocide? So your big focus this week is on genocide and whether it is a function of totalitarianism or not. As I said, of course, you can look at Mussolini and say, well, he didn't commit genocide, even though some historians argue that he did in the mass numbers of Italian people themselves that he had executed. So contemplate this, think about it, look at your required readings. Again, the textbook readings themselves, but also Frank Cohen, chapters 19 and 20, and also the Berkowitz and the Mullen. These are both really, really good pieces discussing genocide and totalitarian states. Berkowitz is focusing on a woman named Hannah Arendt, who was the first, at the time, she wasn't technically an historian. She herself was a survivor of the Holocaust. Made it to the United States. It was a great political thinker. She was what we today would call a political philosopher. She didn't like to think of herself as a philosopher because she disdained philosophy, thinking that it was an abstract that had nothing to do with practical reality. But she spent and was among the first, if not the first person, to actually come up with a definition of totalitarianism and to define it and to consider what was going on in Hitler's Germany and in Stalin's Soviet Union against each other. And again, she lived through this. I mean, she was alive while these guys were doing the things they were doing. So a very, very interesting woman. Her whole discussion of how exactly it is that it happens. All right, if you have questions, feel free to email me. At this point in time, here is your little introduction to the topic, what totalitarianism is, why we confuse communism with totalitarianism, and all of that fun stuff. I look forward to seeing your discussion posts.